There he is.
Hey man, how's it going?
I'm okay. Oh wow. It's 2 minutes later. I was like, oh shit, is he not gonna come? Oh, I'm so happy you came.
Oh yeah, of course.
How you
I'm
doing?
still a little bit sick. So if I have to cough every once in a while, I'll try to remember to hit the mute button.
Nah, I can cut it out too because I want to take it slow and so if there's any like pauses and stuff like that, I won't cut out anything anybody says, but I'll cut out like.
Dude, that's a pretty sick library you got back there.
Oh, that's a green screen.
Oh, okay. I would have totally lied about it if I were you.
But I do have a bookshelf pretty much like that in my living room, except that they're books that have been handed down. They're books my father had. I didn't really become a reader or anything academic until like my 50s. My whole early life, I was a smart guy, but my whole early life was just guitar and trying to get women, and I never could connect with my academic side until much later in life, which is
Well, I think that's probably the path that a healthy person should follow.
yeah. Were you always like this?
Yeah, like I went to something like 35, maybe 40 different schools from kindergarten to 12th grade. So I was just moving sometimes every 2, 3 months, just all the time. And so with the change of environment, I just ended up being kind of a bookworm. And that would be my continuity from place to place, and yeah, I've always been that way.
You were a military brat?
No, just single mother who had some problems and we were poor, moving around, kind of shacking up with whoever we could for a few months until we got evicted and moving on again.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I didn't know that, and it's probably plays a part. It must play a part in the way you see the world, right? And also the emotional intelligence. Uh, so I'm probably gonna talk a little too much at the top, but bear with me because I just think it's important. So, and also I wanna be able to cut in a couple of not things like evidence of the prosecution, but like things of yours that you've said that I've liked and that have moved me, that I've seen of yours. So I might refer to some of them, but I might then later go and replace them with it actually in your own words, if that's okay.
All right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't mind if you got to ask some hard questions, man. I get it. Like, I had this plan way back, like this was like 2016, 2017 when I was first starting a podcast, and I had this great idea with all the political polarization and stuff going on. I was going to go out and I knew these people, so I could go do it, but I was going to interview a white nationalist, a black nationalist, an Israeli settler, and a Palestinian activist, like a hardcore Palestinian activist, and just talk to them, right? And so the first one I was able to set up was the white nationalist dude. And he was like the most polite, nice, friendly person ever. And I'm just have an agreeable personality that when somebody's nice to me, I'm just nice to them. And the whole thing came off like I was just his best friend and everything. And people still give me shit about it. So like I understand, like you gotta, I don't mind. You do what you gotta do.
Well, okay. I'm not, um, I, yeah, I like you're kind of putting yourself as the white nationalist in that analogy, but I don't think you mean to
Well,
do that. No, and
I think to some of
but
your
the
to
but the
some of
grief,
your viewers,
yeah, the grief that I'll
that's
take,
how they're gonna see it.
yeah,
So
and I wanted to ask you about this. Greg Johnson, that's his name. Greg Johnson, right? That's his name.
yeah. Oh, you know about that. Okay, yeah,
I
yeah,
read it, yeah.
exactly.
But I'm
That
gonna
that
ask
was
you.
a lesson, man. That was like when I learned that interviewing is not just like, oh, you sit down and chat with somebody, like it's an actual skill that you have to develop and acquire. Yeah, that was a hard lesson, but
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna ask you. I'm gonna ask you. Listen, I'm not gonna ask you the questions that I've really spent a lot of time wondering about, and I'm not. Well, let me just start. So I
yeah,
was,
yeah.
I was going to start here by reading something, and maybe I'll actually get the actual version of you saying it that you said, which I think nicely sets up the interview with something that I listened to yesterday. You said the following. Many of us have had experiences reading novels where we think that the author must have been writing this as a personal letter to us. It gets to us so well, or some aspect of us. It may even be something that we didn't see or understand about ourselves before, or something we vaguely felt but hadn't been able to articulate well. Nietzsche had no problem articulating himself, But even the most clear thinking and articulate among us are often unclear and inarticulate when thinking or talking about ourselves, at least when we're trying to be honest. A good novel can give us deep insight
into ourselves precisely because we're often not honest with ourselves about ourselves. Early in Notes from the Underground, Dostoevsky writes that, quote, "Every man has reminiscences which he would not tell to everyone, but only to his friends. He has other matters in his mind which he would not reveal even to his friends, but only to himself, and then only in secret. But there are other things which a man is afraid to tell even to himself. And every decent man has a number of such things stored away in his mind."
But let me get over to Dostoevsky, because I think he believed that stuff, and so some of what he says in this essay, Jewish Question, he starts out by saying something which I would have also attributed to you should you have believed these things that I'm asking about. He said, "It goes without saying that everything required by humaneness and justice, everything called for by compassion and the Christian law, must be done for the Jews." Meaning that despite what God may feel about them, this way I took it, our obligation as Christians is to still treat them with humanity and treat them with Christian values.
I'm curious what gave you the impression that you just mentioned, though. That despite the fact that God feels this way about them or something, we as Christians nevertheless. Where'd you get the first part of that? I don't.
Oh, because, well, there's much more that he says here.
Okay, so that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he says things like, "Thus, it is not for nothing that over there the Jews are reigning everywhere, over stock exchange. It is not for nothing that they control capital, that they are the masters of credit. And it is not for nothing, I repeat, that they are also the masters of international politics. And what is going to happen in the future is known to the Jews themselves. Their reign, their complete reign is approaching. We are approaching the complete triumph of ideas before which sentiments of humanity, thirst for truth, Christian and national feelings, and even those of national dignity must bow. On the contrary, we are approaching materialism, a blind carnivorous craving for personal material wealth, a craving for personal accumulation of money by any means. This is all that has been proclaimed as the supreme aim, as a reasonable thing, as liberty, in lieu of the Christian idea of salvation only through the closest moral and brotherly fellowship of man." And he goes on, "Ask the native population in our border regions what is propelling the Jew, has been propelling him for centuries. You will receive a unanimous answer: mercilessness." Now, mercilessness has been something you already mentioned as something that the Jews didn't have a concept of mercy. And Dostoevsky talks about
At least I think outside the group, certainly they have a well-developed concept of mercy.
And the last thing here, he has been prompted for so many centuries only by pitilessness for us, only by thirst for our sweat and blood. So he's laying a lot on the Jews there, and so the natural reaction to that was get rid of the Jews, kill the Jews. Like how can you tolerate a people that believe all this stuff? And then he says, it goes without saying, everything required by humaneness and justice, everything called for by compassion and the Christian law must be done to the Jews. Now, is he talking out of both sides of his mouth? I mean, is he just giving a disclaimer?
I think what he's saying, and this is so hard to do,
Yeah.
is, he's trying to talk about a political problem, but then calling on people in their individual lives to treat others with kindness and respect, and and that's a tough thing. It's a hard line to walk, especially, I mean, he doesn't even walk it that well in some of those passages that you put, that you just mentioned. So, I mean, I do think that it's important to understand too,
do you think he was an anti-Semite?
I mean, look, if you took that guy who wrote those things and brought him up to 2024 America, then yeah, of course, he's like a raging anti-Semite, right? But I do think you have to put people in the context of their time, and so that the language they use and the way they frame and talk about things, a lot of times is not, this isn't a way of excusing people for past sins, in different periods. But I'm very much of the feeling that, a person's, when you're looking at history, like a person's faults are often common with his era and his time and his people, and his virtues, you should let him have to himself, and so, yeah, look, the thing is, you go back to that period of time. I think he was probably writing that in the 1870s. I can't remember, but I think it was. I mean, there was a lot going on, socially and politically. Jewish emancipation was just, it was causing a confrontation similar, not in detail, but like, similar to how the great migration of blacks out of the South, like into the northern and western cities, like just the confrontation of these two different peoples who had like preconceptions about each other and had different ideas of just different customs and stuff. It's going to create conflict and tension. And the Western Russia was just full of that at the time, and they were having to deal with very real problems, right? Like,
But Darryl,
you had the Jews who were confined to the Pale of Settlement. Jewish emancipation happens, and they go into the cities that they'd previously been kept out of. And the Jews were, these are people who were literate, numerate, had been for generations, were experienced in business, because it's not like they could own land and be a farmer or something like that. And so they had all this experience. They had networks that already existed that often went across borders, all these kind of things. And they were going into the cities and just out competing everybody. And like, it was creating a lot of resentment among the lower classes, like the people who wanted to be the Russian middle class, and they're getting just completely out competed by, the Jews who were flooding into these cities. And if you're somebody who's trying to run an empire, or Dostoevsky is kind of writing on behalf of one, like, at that point, you have to look at that and say, they don't look at it just, again, this is an empire, multi-ethnic empire. They don't just look at it in terms of, civil rights or individual liberty or whatever it is. They say, how are we going to manage these populations in a way that keeps conflict down? And so again, this isn't a way of excusing it and saying, in his time, he wasn't an anti-Semite or something. It's just a way of saying it, like, it's hard for us to like understand where somebody like that's coming from at the time. You know what I mean?
Darryl, I do understand, and have often. Let me just close my door. I do understand, and I've often made time and place arguments to people on every subject there is, because I believe them. I've even made time and place arguments to forgiving us, not forgiving, to put in context to fundamentalist Muslim anti-Semitism today, because yeah, it's in 2024, but in their time and place, it's no different than what you're describing for Dostoevsky. But nevertheless, that is in the end, a dangerous argument to make, because because what you're saying is that there could be no anti-Semitism in 19th century Russia, and therefore what he's saying is not anti-Semitism, and the pogroms that it led to were not anti-Semitic, and that all judgment of people starts today at noon, and everything else is a result of time and place, and it can't be. The guy hated the Jews at a time when hating the Jews was acceptable, and he actually took a pen to paper to write, to try to persuade people that the Jews were a terrible threat, that we controlled the future. We were pulling the strings on everything. And this is very important, because this will get us into the Nazis. This is not a dummy we're talking about. This is perhaps one of the top 10 most insightful people that's ever walked the face of the earth. So we can't really just easily cut him a time and place excuse, even within his time and place, because he wasn't of his time and place mentally. He was superhuman when it came to insight. He saw insight around corners, and he had this huge blind spot when it came to the Jews, and that's best explained by anti-Semitism. Like how else would a guy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't anti-Semitism was a word that was used back then as like it was a political and intellectual movement. People would call themselves that, it wasn't, in that sense. But I don't know, I guess, like, to me, the interesting thing is like the dynamic that you're kind of demonstrating by reading those quotes and talking about the time period. We could call it anti-Semitism, and that's fine. I don't know. I don't have a particular attachment to the word. Like, to me, there was conflict. There was social conflict between the like as
Well, I'll
nationalist
tell you what.
feeling rose
I'll tell you
throughout
what.
Europe.
I'm going to tell you what the attachment to the word is, because what he's
Yeah.
saying there is the same thing. Very. I mean, like when I say the same thing, I mean the same thing, almost like it's a paraphrase of what's in the Hamas charter, what white nationalists say today, and we Jews are still dealing with these accusations. And to us, it's the same thing, and it hasn't changed. So when is the line we say, okay, no, as of this date, we're not contorting ourselves to try to put context on what you're saying. What you're saying is, unacceptable. It's hatred, it's anti-Semitism, and you are evil. These are you are evil. Now, you want to say Dostoevsky was not evil? I do struggle with it. Thomas Jefferson had slaves. Again, Thomas Jefferson was not some knucklehead, to use Tim Walz's phrase. Thomas Jefferson was the guy who wrote beautifully about how slavery was wrong, right? So it's like, it's hard to give Jefferson a pass when he's even written about how slavery degraded the slave master and the slave master psychology. So it's like, if you didn't know he owned slaves, you would read Thomas Jefferson and you'd be sure this guy was an abolitionist, right? This guy was so you can't really give him a pass. And yet somehow, of course, what we are seeing is his time and place. So I can't want to be simplistic about it. But he's your favorite philosopher, so let me just
Yeah, and I mean,
entertain
look,
the idea that maybe your attachment to him as the most important thing in your life is causing you to be a little easy on him here.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I don't discount that at all. No doubt about it. But I do think I extend the same sort of maybe excessive, I don't know, but empathy to other people as well who who I don't feel that way about. There was this actually, there's two things I want to say that will kind of illustrate where I'm coming from. One has to do just with my background, right? Like I grew up in the gutter. I grew up in California ghettos, Southside Stockton, South LA. I grew up in places where there's a lot of ugliness going on around me. A lot of violence, a lot of just social decay, all the fallout of social decay in America. And I grew up with a lot of people who I knew well, good friends of mine, people I spent years, just as friends, people who were just as smart as me.
Mm-hmm.
They were no less good-hearted than me when they were 10 years old. They were no weaker than me. They didn't have any weaknesses that I didn't have. I don't have any particular strengths that they didn't have, right? They were just as good as me. And most of them ended up as drug addicts, in prison, dead. And not only that, but the type of person that you would look at and you'd say, that's fuck that person. Like, that's a bad person, and they did become that. But I look at those situations and I just say, like, that, again, it wasn't my virtues or their particular deficiencies that made us different. It was the fact that, like, at this particular critical moment, this cop decided not to arrest me after I got in a fight and let me go. Whereas if he had arrested me and, like, then the consequences of that would have played out, who knows where I end up. Or I had a coach, a wrestling coach, who took an interest in me at, like, a critical period where I really needed somebody to do that. And they didn't have that. Just little things that happen, and I could be that guy and he could be me. And I really have always believed that, right? So, and maybe you can trace back even a little bit further. Like my father, I don't know my father. I never met, he was out of the picture when I was 2, but he came out with his family, or his parents came out with the Okies during the Dust Bowl period, right? And people who are from California know that, like, it wasn't all giant John Steinbeck stories and stuff. Like the Okies were a holy terror, you know, everybody hated them. There was a lot of drunkenness, fighting, eventually drug use, crime, all these kind of things. Not, you know, again, to tar a whole population of people is my father's side of people, but a lot of social problems. And my father was a criminal. He was in prison most of my life. He's dead now, but I never knew him, and he was a bad guy. You know, he hurt people, he robbed people, he was a bad person. And like, again, he was not a part of my life at all. And people have asked, like they used to ask me in the past, like if I had any anger toward the man. And I always told him the same thing. Like, first of all, like I don't know him. He never did anything like directly to hurt me, but like I had heard stories from my mom and from my grandparents and stuff of him being 11 years old and being taught to shoot heroin by his uncle, and being 13 years old and his mom throws him out of the house for like an entire 6 months and he's sleeping on a park bench at 13 years old. And so I'm just like, I'm not going to judge that guy. Like, what do I know about any of that? You know what I mean? And so like that's maybe the source of my general disposition when it comes to those kind of things, right?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and so the second thing, and this is less personal, but like there was this incident that's always stuck with me. I read about a while ago, I think in a Steven Pinker book. It was in the 1600s, and it was in Germany, and one of their periodic witch hunts was going on. And there was this like governor of a given area or something, and these two Jesuit priests went and told him there's this witch, and we're gonna execute this witch, and we have these other warrants to execute or whatever. Well, this governor gets a little like, okay, well, how do you know she did it? Well, because this person, he's like, take me down to her. So they go down to the torture chamber, and you have these two priests there, and he looks at she's there, and she's tied up to the rack, and he says, executioner, get over here. Give her a few more turns on the rack and stretch her out some more, like make it really hurt. And so he does it. And then like, as she's screaming, he says, these two priests over here, what do you know about them? They're in on this too, aren't they? And so of course she screams out, yes, like awful, like they're the worst. They, copulate with demons and have black masses and da 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 da. The whole like detailed like outline of accusations. And so he looks over at the priest and he says, so should I tie you up to the rack now? Right. And here's the thing that really stuck with me about it. Not that happened, right? That like that governor clearly had a strong moral sense that was uncommon at his time. And yet he called the executioner over and had him turn the wheel a few more times on this poor woman, right? That's one. But then these priests actually became like activists. Like they wrote a book and then went around talking to governors and other priests and stuff, and were like the main force that put an end to witch hunts in Germany, right? So clearly these were men who, like, once they were presented with this, the immorality and injustice of what they were doing, they changed. These are good men who had been going around for the last however long, rounding up innocent women, torturing and killing them, But how can you say that those are not good men? Of course, like they demonstrated that when their eyes were opened. And so it's not that you say the things that they did before that were therefore good, or that they're not to be blamed for those things. It's just to say that, like, we're all thrown into this world, and by the time we open our eyes and shake the cobwebs out and realize, like, oh, I'm a person who has to make my own decisions and find my way in this place, there's so much momentum built up behind you by that point that, like, your range of options is usually very, very narrow, like much narrower than we think. And there's a reason we revere saints. There's a reason we revere people who step wildly outside the current of their time to point out things that other people are not seeing,
Yes.
And that's the standard that I think we shouldn't hold people back into.
Let me say where I agree with you, and then get to, a few other things. I made a similar point to you just about your last point. I made a similar point to people about, like, they'll find some quote from Abraham Lincoln that by today's standards would be considered racist.
Yeah.
And I say, look, the great men in history were able to see a little bit above the heads of everyone else around them. That's what made them great. They stood on tippy toes, and that's the progress. And that progress was what made them great. If you're going to say that there was no great man in history, unless they could intuit everything that we've come to decide today, then there were no great men in history. So yeah, Lincoln has to be defined as great by how he saw above the heads of the people around him, not how he saw below our heads, because it's not realistic. That's how progress is made. But Darryl, listen, I'm against the death penalty because I believe that innocent people get convicted a lot, and it's just not worth it. And you've kind of been on trial to prove your character in certain quarters, and in the law there's the concept of certain evidence being prejudicial, and I've been struggling to figure out what's going on, and I would fault you, like, honestly, I would fault you for not being clearer, but I would, I could draw the through line between talking about Matthew and talking about the Jews in a leprous temple, the praise of Dostoevsky, which you know that he said these things about the Jews controlling international politics and the masters of what will happen in the future, to align to what you had said about Churchill and the Jews, the Jewish financiers installing him because they wanted the war. I mean, the themes that you are saying now are, if not anti-Semitic, but they would be a raging anti-Semite today. These themes are evoked in some of the positions that you've taken, and not only by bad faith actors. They're kind of the plain meaning of things that you've said, and then you have retracted and clarified. But you being so smart and so sophisticated, it became very, very hard for me to give you the full benefit of the doubt. And I think when I said one tweet, I said, well, what is he up to here? Like, and then, so let me just lay it out. Now, to be clear, you've written, sorry to disappoint readers on both the right and left, I am not a fascist. I distrust all mass movements, mobs, whether they march under the banner of fascism, communism, mass democracy, or whatever. But then you've also written, fascism is when enough normal people realize they can't take another step back without falling off a cliff. And fascism is just an autoimmune overreaction to the flesh-eating bacteria called the left. But then, when there was this LGBT send-up of the Last Supper, you tweeted. You took the tweet down. You tweeted a piece of a picture of the Nazi occupation in Paris, juxtaposed to that LGBT trans Last Supper, and you said that the Nazi occupation of Paris was infinitely preferable in every way. You deleted it, but then like a month or two later, you kind of revisited the sentiment when somebody at Cambridge claimed that Jesus might have had a trans body. You wrote, must not post Hitler meme.
That was more of a joke about.
I know, but it was kind of like, it's kind of like toying the fact, like, yeah, I took down this other tweet. Well, I'll lay it all out. You have, to your credit, you've complained that Nick Fuentes is an anti-Semite, that Jake Shields is an anti-Semite. You've disparaged people sitting down with David Duke. Today, earlier on, you talked about your interview with Greg Johnson and what it was like to be seen being so chummy with Greg Johnson. And you tweeted about anti-Semitism. I've seen it consume the lives of a few otherwise smart and well put together people. But then you yourself tweet out Guten Morgen to this self-proclaimed Nazi. You have a mug with a Nazi symbol on it. This is the same guy.
Yeah,
this is the same guy who says that Hitler was a prophet.
He's great. Look, yeah, no,
I'm almost finished.
Yeah,
one excerpt of his writing. Hitler was an armed prophet called to wage holy war in a monumental battle between good and evil. And then when somebody talked about when they tried to rise up against Hitler, You say, I understand why the Allies glorify men who attempt to assassinate their country's popular leader, but I've never been able to share their enthusiasm. I've never been able to share their enthusiasm for the assassination of Hitler. The guy who did your logo, this guy Arthur Kwan Lee, is a vicious anti-Semite, the worst of all. You know, maybe you didn't know it at the time, but something about you attracted him to you, and the logo is still up there, so it's kind of like being chummy with him. When you interview Greg Johnson, a self-described white nationalist and another fan of Hitler, I don't begrudge you the interview. People should listen and decide for themselves. But it really seems like you were of like mind, not about white nationalism, but about all the forces that were allied against him. So all of which is to say that it's tough to understand. And I want you to talk about your whatever sympathy you have for fascism and why it is that you are not sympathetic to people who wish Hitler was assassinated.
Well, I was making a more general statement.
Well, and why it is that you're comfortable, like you could text the guy good morning. You know, I take it that anytime you do something on Twitter, you're playing to the audience. And
Right.
And so what point? It's got to be a complex point if there's a point. If you're not sympathetic to the Nazis and to the idea that the Jews pulled the strings to assure that World War II would happen, if you're not sympathetic to all that, then what point are you trying to make, and why is somebody so sophisticated playing into the hands of the people who are going to assassinate your character?
Well, where do you want me to start with that one? Because
This is very important. I want to give you every opportunity to
yeah.
speak. You know.
So, I guess the first thing to say is that I don't use the internet in the most intelligent way all the time. Social media, right? I treat it like a group chat a lot of times, like way too much. And so when something happens, like when I put up the thing about the trans Last Supper or whatever, like the point of that post was, this is the worst shit I've ever seen in my life, right? That's what I'm trying to say. Well, how do you do that in a way that is going to force people to, it's just the most provocative way possible it's going to do that. We know what that is in our culture, is a picture of Hitler. And if I were to put a picture of the devil looming over the Eiffel Tower, Satan himself looming over the Eiffel Tower, and say the picture on the right is preferable to what I'm seeing on the left here, it wouldn't have the same impact, right? That's sort of taken the place of that. So it's just like a way of expressing my outrage in the most extreme way I could think of. But
then you should want the Allies to have assassinated Hitler.
Well,
right?
The Allies didn't assassinate him.
No, you should have. I mean, you should have wanted. I'm sorry. You should have wanted the Germans to have assassinated Hitler. You should have been with
that's kind of my point. Like, look, I don't like what Benjamin Netanyahu's doing in Gaza right now. But if his defense minister betrayed him and killed him, like, I would think that guy was not a good guy. Like, I don't. It's like this. Like, I ask people a lot of times, and I think you can divide pretty much all of humanity into like two different groups, like that are well grouped by their answer to the question of whether you think the Unabomber's brother was a hero or a villain. Because to me, he was just an unmitigated villain. He turned in his brother, to the federal authorities. Other people look at it and say his brother was a murderer and he did the right thing. And neither of those answers are right or wrong. But I know how I feel about it, is that he was a villain. He betrayed his brother. And so that's all I meant by that.
But you also said Hitler wasn't the main villain in World War II. You said a lot, Darryl. You know that.
I've explained myself on that one. And I mean, we can talk about that if you want. Like,
it's the sum total.
Okay. Look, here's part of the issue, right?
Yeah.
If you talk to a Chinese person and say, what was World War II? What was it about? Tell me about World War II. They're going to give you a story. Japanese person, you talk to, you're going to get different stories. If you talk to any Jewish person, what was World War II about?
We know.
World War II is about the Holocaust.
Yes.
It was about this guy named Hitler who wanted to kill the Jews, and he went over to the East and he did it. Like, that's what 60 million dead, a world devastated, like a war that reordered global, geopolitics for maybe the next 500, all these things. This is what it was about. And that totally makes sense. My wife's Armenian, and the First World War was about the Armenian genocide to her and her people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But and just because like it doesn't mean that to me, or because it means more than that to me, it's not an excuse to be flippant about these things. And like when I took down that post, not because there was some backlash to it, or I don't care about that if it's not clear. Like I did it because of you, because I know where you're coming from, and that if you tell me like, dude, what the hell, like that I should probably step back and ask myself that same question. And so I did, and I looked at it, and I think I made a post about it afterwards about like, because then all that, the anti-Semites came into the thread, and they're like, you shouldn't have taken it down, like, don't back down from these people, whatever. And I was like, no, I was being an asshole. Like if I were in a room and something terrible happened, and I said, this is worse than 9/11. And then I found out that actually there's somebody over here whose dad died in 9/11 in that room, then I'm going to feel like a douchebag, and I'm going to take that back and apologize. And so you have an obligation to like be sensitive to the sort of elevated sacred meaning that symbols like that have to other people. But it doesn't, and I think it's probably hard for a lot of Jews to even imagine that, to other people, and this is the case with me, that that World War II, like that the Holocaust was an episode in a gigantic conflict. It wasn't.
Would you prefer fascism to what is going on now in Western Europe?
Well, look, so I mean, I don't want to get into a historical debate about like fascism, but like fascism to me is like a very time bounded and circumstance bounded political phenomenon during the interwar period, right? So, but if you want to talk about like fascism, like it's used today, and that's kind of what I was responding to in that one.
I think you also said you feel like it's kind of inevitable that we're going to get into something like that because people can't take the left anymore. I think I don't have it.
Yes, yeah, that's the kind of the point I was trying to make,
and that will be preferable.
I think this point's been made by a lot of liberals. Like I listen to people like I've heard Eric Weinstein say this. I've heard like people of his sort of general political outlook say we got to get the left under control because that's where it's heading. Like this is inevitable unless we get this under control. And I do believe that, yeah.
But would it be preferable?
You never know, man. Like the thing is like everybody wants a revolution because they think that when it's all over and the dust settles, like they're going to end up on top and things are going to be the way they want. But that's not how it goes. People can, like, a better way to put it would be like, is there an impulse in me that wishes, like when I see something like that Last Supper desecration, that the French government, the French people would just elect a guy who's going to like round those people up and like deport them? Yeah, there's definitely that impulse in me when I see that. I 100% recognize that might not, even if they do that one thing, that might not go away in a direction that I'm happy with.
Okay, I got to stop. But I mean, the impulse, of course, the entire Constitution is kind of written because we understand how dangerous impulses are, and we try to create a system which can protect us from them. But this is the rub, is that everything that you fear about the mob is then facilitated through any kind of fascism. That's what fascism.
Yes.
That's what fascism means to me. Is that the
100%.
mob will rule? So how could you even hesitate about whether it would be?
Because I think we have mob rule now. I mean, that's all. Like, it's not that. I think we're already in that state. I think we have mob rule now, and so that's what I'm comparing it to. But I mean, look, I don't hold forms of government like as like sacred totems. Democracy, like I don't. If I were drawing up a government from scratch, mass democracy mediated by mass media is not the way I would draw it up. Not to say that, who am I to gainsay the people who put this system together, but like, it's not the way I would draw it up. But that's not ever how the world works.
How would you draw it up?
Oh, I mean, I would, if I were starting from scratch, I'd like to see a system of representation that sort of started more from the bottom up than, and again, this like is a very theoretical conversation, but like, I think that people are not represented by, like, who feels represented by their government right now? Nobody feels represented. Well, you get to vote. Okay. Like, do you feel represented by this government? Most people say no. Almost everybody says no. And so what's really going on if most people don't feel represented by a representative government? It means that the system of mediating that representation is not functioning, right? And I think that democracy, everybody goes to the poll and takes a vote on something, is probably great for a New England township. Maybe it's great for like, a state, it's, on some level. But I think when you get to a place like we have now, where you're not talking about convincing individuals, you're talking about moving masses of people in one direction or another, that it boils down to lowest common denominator, just base, ugly emotions. And that's what the political system becomes consumed by. And I mean, it's not like I'm original pointing that out, right? But
Well, you said something to Tucker along these lines, and I'm going to get to it. But I just want to say, I don't feel. I'm not sure what it means to feel represented by the government. I don't want to be represented by the government in any kind of values. There's too much.
When I say
diversity.
represented, I just mean that I don't mean that like your values are being imposed on other people. I just mean that you and people who feel the way you do, that you're being heard,
Yeah,
and listened to. Like, and what I think is, and again, this is just an entirely theoretical
but if
discussion.
I want to ask you I just want to ask you a question because related to what we're saying. So however it is that you see a better system, you don't have to figure it all out now. It's quite a homework assignment to figure out a new system of government. Would it preclude those LGBT people from doing what they did? That's really the heart of the matter. You would have a better system, and they would, in your system of government, those LGBT people, one way or another, would not be allowed to do that Last Supper, that disrespectful Last Supper, as they did. And I agree, it was disrespectful. It's not pleasant
On that stage,
in your system of government anywhere.
right?
Like,
But they wouldn't be allowed to do it on that stage.
Yeah,
probably not.
probably not.
Yeah, I mean, I don't
And how
think
about
they'd
how
be-
about privately, or in a concert hall?
I don't have the right or any particular interest in regulating, that kind of thing. It's not. It's not even like a libertarian moral sense that makes me say that. It's just, we have to be practical about the consequences of it's like what you're saying, like once we start empowering the state or using the tools of power to regulate what people are doing in their private lives, then there's no end to that.
Yeah.
But I do think, yeah, absolutely. If I was king of the universe, and they said, hey, we've got a 15-minute presentation, 15 minutes to represent Paris to the entire world, the Olympic opening ceremony, and we want to use 6 of those minutes to desecrate the Last Supper, I would be like, no. And you're lucky I don't arrest you. Get out of my office. Yes, of course I would not allow that.
So this touches on what you said to Tucker. Now, my read on you, I don't think you're a white nationalist. I never heard you say anything like that. I've never heard you, not once. I think that you do have a kind of practical view of the world about what can work and what just can't work. And I'll read what you said to Tucker. Where does this start? He asks you, Tucker's pointing out about how everything's terrible in the world. How did things go right in Japan? Have a country of self-respect and order and cleanliness. And you say, well, I think we ran an experiment that tells us pretty well what that is. And we didn't know we were running the experiment at the time. But you had the Iron Curtain set up and all the countries behind it that were not exposed to the incessant American world order, Western propaganda for 70 years. They all don't have these same problems. You go to Hungary, the people have no problem saying, this is the heart of the matter. The people have no problem saying, no, this is a country. This is Hungary. This is a country for Hungarians. This is a Christian country. This is our country. We don't have a problem saying that. That is not something that anybody west of the Iron Curtain, for the most part, is comfortable loosening up a little bit, thank God. But you know, the question is whether it's loosening up too late. So what you're saying is that we went wrong, they went right. They preserved for themselves the ability to say, this is Hungary, this is a country for Hungarians, and this is a Christian country. And that works. And that's what works in Japan. I mean, I would argue that, you know, you also call Israel an ethno-state, but you know that's
well,
that,
yeah, but that's a, you know,
the
that's
Jews
not
would say the Jews would say
I don't
the
make
same
a value
thing.
judgment when I say that. You know, I'm not
well,
making a value judgment.
No, the term ethno-state is a value judgment. But anyway, I think.
Yeah, it's like, again, we travel in different circles.
Well, it's like the word apartheid it's a conclusion too. Yeah, I mean, no other country is described as ethno-state, and I've never heard the word ethno-state used in any work that was not critical of whoever was being disguised as.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure.
So that
Yeah.
speaks for itself. But anyway,
Yeah.
you look favorably with the idea that people can say this is Hungary. It's a country for Hungarians, and this is a country for Christians.
Yeah.
And not because I think, obviously you're not even Hungarian, but because you understand that this works and you don't think the alternative is going to work, that we're just going to tear each other apart eventually.
No, well, look, so I'm going to give you two answers to that. Because, like, one, it's not just a practical matter. To me, it's just like a deep moral question, you know, that the Hungarian people, and I think all Zionists understand this as well or better than anybody else. You know, Zionism grew not out of like a period of just unprecedented oppression in Europe. You know, there have been many periods of unprecedented oppression. You go back to like the Black Plague of the 14th century, and I mean, it was a nightmare for Jews all over the place. That had happened before. It was the combination of the oppression with Jewish emancipation and this beginning of assimilation that was starting to happen, and people starting to realize that unless we have our own little spot of land somewhere on this earth where our people, our culture, can live out its destiny and we can work out our destiny among ourselves, we're not going to survive. And the Jewish people should survive. And I agree with that. The Hungarian people should survive. The Japanese people, all these people should survive. Now, we were talking about Europe at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I probably did talk about this in that, but the United States is very different from Europe. You know, we've had demographic turnover literally from the moment we became a country, right? The American Revolution happens and it's an Anglo country, but then literally within a generation, like the Anglos are like a minority in a lot of East Coast cities because the Irish and the Germans are moving in. A generation goes by, you have Jews and Italians, Southern and Eastern Europeans who are displacing the Irish. 1924, immigration from overseas mostly gets cut off, but then you have 6 or 7 million African Americans coming out of the South and transforming the way the rest of the country looks. And then 1965, the Great Migration peters out, and you have the Hart-Celler Act and the mass immigration wave that we're in now. So we've constantly had to accommodate new people in our story, like throughout our history. It's really like who and what we are. You know, when like I get, you know, again, this is the funny thing is, like, I get in trouble with anti-Semites as much as I get in trouble with a lot of your audience. And I get in trouble with white nationalists as much as I do with like anti-racists, like leftists.
But it's different. It's different. It's different. You get in trouble with anti-Semites because they feel you're betraying them because they think you're in the same cause.
Okay, yeah. Well, so we'll talk about that in a second because that's true. But we'll talk about it in a second. When the left, you know, people on the left say we're a nation of immigrants, people hate that on the right. It's obviously true. And it's not just true that we've had wave after wave of immigrants and that's how we populated the continent. It's that deep in our identity is built in this concept of openness, that like if we didn't have this sense of openness, we wouldn't have been able to populate and settle the continent. It would have got taken over by Mexico and France and maybe China on the West Coast or whatever, because we just wouldn't have had the people. If we were going to have the people to do it, we had to have this radical openness. You go back to the first Naturalization Act in 1793. White nationalists loved this because it says all free white persons of good character can be citizens of the United States. They say, see, 1793, there's already race consciousness and blah, 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 blah. And I always point out to them, I'm like, dude, like take yourself back to 1793. Europeans still have 200 years of just butchering each other. They hate each other. They don't think of each other as the same. And now you have this revolutionary country coming and saying, if you live in Europe and, anywhere over there, like they didn't even imagine that like people were going to come from, East Africa to the US. That wasn't even in their minds, but they were saying anybody in Europe, if you come over here and you're of good character, you can become a citizen of our country, enjoying the full rights of like the richest person in this place, at least legally. Radically, revolutionarily open, right? And that is at the core of our identity as a people, right? Is that sense of openness. And so I wouldn't say, or when you say like, does it work? When I'm talking about a place like Hungary, or the fact that the English people are on track to be a minority in England, something that's not going to be reversed, it's not going to be changed, it's not going to go back to the way it was once it happens. To me, that's a moral crime and a historical tragedy, like that people would inflict that on their people. After hundreds of years of these people holding themselves together and creating like a culture and identity to then do that to them, I think is a crime. In the United States, so in other words, with them, like it's not just a question of whether it works or not, and it's not the primary question to me. Here in the United States, to me, the whole idea of like this is just we are this people and outsiders, that's never been us. And so we're different than the Hungarians and the English and like all the peoples of Europe. We're just completely different. And so for us, it is a practical question. Like over here, it's not a moral. I mean, there's moral aspects to it, right? Like if I were to, this is a democracy where theoretically political power is wielded through the ballot. And so if you go to a people and say, we're going to make a policy change that's going to make the descendants of all the people who live here right now a voting minority in this place in 100 years, there's a moral aspect to that. But here, like it really is about like what works. And it's just like you'll hear like Austrian school, like libertarian types who just read their first Mises book will always want to talk about like the inefficiencies that state intervention in the economy creates, right? I got into actually a big argument one time with Art Laffer at this seminar that I went to about this. And I finally kind of backed him into a corner, even though he's way smarter than me. Like I just had the correct point, I think, which is, and he would talk about all the inefficiencies. You do this, it's going to create an inefficiency over there. State intervenes here, it's going to create an inefficiency here. And I told him that, that while it's going to create inefficiencies, like no question about that, there are costs on the other side, that you're not accounting for. That was a digression. The point is, just like there are inefficiencies, state intervention in the economy that anybody who's going to talk about economics has to account for and understand. Multiculturalism, diversity, like all of these things. This is not to say that there are no benefits to these things. There are costs and there are difficulties and there are problems that you have to deal with, right? And it's not all evil nativists versus the innocent newcomer, like that, the way it kind of gets framed, like in that term, or evil majority versus like innocent minority. It's just that these are real practical issues that have to be dealt with. And I think we have to be honest about that and recognize that, there are limits to how far we can push certain things before the costs start to outweigh the benefits, and we just don't do that because we take it as a straight moral question. We have to just continue to, like with immigration, for example, it would be immoral to tell people that they can't come in. And of course it is, like on some level, this is the hard part about it. Like, I'm an immigration restrictionist when I go to the vote. If you put me at a table in a room and had a family come in and tell me their story and say, this is where we're coming from, like, I'm going to let that person in, or I'm not going to be able to think of myself as a human being when I go home,
Well,
but then you open the...
Yeah, as I say, this is very, very true what you're saying. We're going to run out of time. So
Sorry.
I've said to many people I know who are, anti-immigration, I said, but you do know that your entire life you've been around illegal immigrants who you were close to, who, who helped you, who, or, and how do you reconcile all that? It's, and like you, I focus on the conflict within the question and the hypocrisy within, a vote, exactly what you're expressing. Like, I want to keep them all out, but I do understand on some level, if they did get over the line, I would never throw them out, and I also know it seems heartless, but of course you can't just let the entire world come here. So this is very difficult, and the heartlessness with which people talk about this issue is really, really disturbs me.
You know what I think?
Yeah.
I think that that heartlessness partly comes from that that moral struggle that you're kind of describing right now, that we're talking about, where you take people who are like not evil people, like in their just entire being or something, and maybe they're good neighbors and they're good fathers and sons and whatever, but they need to be able to tell that family, no, you're not coming in. I don't care if your kids are starving or whatever, like, we're full. In order to be able to do that and still go home and sleep at night,
Yeah.
One of the shortcuts is to tell yourself that those people are evil, those people are bad, those people don't deserve it, or whatever.
Well, this is the theme. This is the theme in your work.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This is the theme in your work.
No, it is. It's like it's a means of like, it's a means by which we like permit ourselves to do things that violate our moral sense, but which seem practically necessary, and I look, man, we have to guard against that all the time, I mean, and I know we're running out of time, but there is one thing I want to like mention is, all the, whether they're anti-Semites or whoever like that are followers of mine and who often get upset with me, but for the reason you said, I just think it's important. I've always thought this, and maybe it's possible I'm deluding myself here, but this is the way I think about it, is that I think it's important to maintain a bridge to those people, to everybody. And that, whereas on one hand, like, there are probably people out there who are not political or not thinking about this stuff at all, who maybe see something that I write on Twitter and then read the comments and follow that, and they end up down a rabbit hole that I wish they wouldn't have. I'm sure that happens, and I feel responsible for that, even if I don't always act like it, like I do. But on the other hand, there are people out there who the only people who are willing to tell them that, like, look, yes, the first Biden administration cabinet was like 80% Jewish. The only people who are willing to tell them that are crazy anti-Semites who hate Jews, and they want you to hate Jews, and that's why they're telling you it. And so for those people to say that, like, well, Darryl knows that, and he's not afraid to talk about that, but he doesn't hate Jews, and he makes that clear, like, when he talks about it explicitly, I think that's important. They can look at it and say that there's a way to talk about these things without falling into that trap.
But
you know what I
Darryl,
mean?
This is really where you and I kind of, where I just can't come there with you, and I fear the worst sometime, is that for a guy who says what you're saying now, if I was in your shoes and I knew that I had a huge following, of people who think that I'm an anti-Semite, that would not last long. I would make sure that they were disabused immediately. I would tell them, do not think I'm one of you guys. I would block them, but more than block them, I would ridicule them, and I would do everything to disassociate myself. Because let me say, because I have people sometimes come to me with very anti-Arab stuff, very anti-Palestinian stuff. And I'm like, go fuck yourself. I'm not one of you. As a matter of fact, one of the first things I got into Twitter on, right at, like, on October 8th, there was some dumb idiot. Turns out later I found out he has mental illness. This kid at a protest, AOC retweeted it, and he was like, he had some ugly slogan on his T-shirt. And he's like, kill the Arabs. Like, he's saying the most outrageous things. and I tweeted, I said, not in my name, and then I went about trying to find out, because it's, it's a small community, to try to find out who this guy was. I wanted to make sure that somebody spoke to him. That's how I found out he had mental illness. Like, it was so important to me to just drive this ugly sentiment into the ground, because I don't want for 10 seconds to be associated with anybody who hates Arabs, doesn't care about the fact that they're dying, doesn't understand the sorrow of a mother whose children are dying, and also doesn't understand that there's a certain limit psychologically to what you can expect in terms of, disinterested understanding of international politics when they're suffering and dying and seeing this kind of stuff. Like, they're only human. So I really go out of my way, and still I seem to fall short sometimes. But the most important thing to me is that if I want to advocate for Israel and for the Jewish people and for our ethno-state, which I'm happy, I think you said that you're okay with an ethno-state. I don't want to ever be mistaken for one of these bigots, for one of these haters. And I wish I saw that in you, because then I would say, don't you talk about my Darryl that way, because look at all the trouble he goes through to make sure nobody misunderstands him.
This is something, though, that we see differently. Like, this isn't a matter of like, where
it's in your self-interest too, by the way. It's in your self-interest too, but go ahead.
I agree with that 100%. But like, to me, like the people who are out there saying kill all the Arabs, who is going to walk them back from that cliff if not you? It's not going to be Ta-Nehisi Coates. Right. They're not listening to him. They don't care what he has to say. They care what you have to say, because they know
care what
that,
you have to say.
That's kind of my point. Like, I think it's important to maintain a lifeline with all of these people.
Darryl, you're not walking them back when you talk about Churchill being installed by Jews. You're not walking them back when you say this stuff about Churchill and I mean, I don't think you're walking them back, respectfully.
Look, I think you, like, if I were to come out and say, right, something that they can go look up themselves, right, and that and some, Uncle Adolf 1488 in the comments section somewhere is going to give them links that can be verified, that they're going to be able to go look up, and they see me denying that because I don't, because it's wrong to sort of talk about, then they're never going to listen to me again. They're never going to talk to me again. Like, you have to be able to talk about things in the way that you see them, and let, so that people know, even if they disagree, that you're trying to do that. I mean,
you can't deny the truth. You can't deny the truth. I get that.
Right.
I don't know if it's really 80% of the Biden cabinet, but
it was like, there's a Times of Israel story, like when it first came out, it was obviously celebratory, but like it was in a way that, like, if they were all Arabs or they were all Han Chinese or something, it would have been the only thing people noticed about it, right? It was like a massive, massive number of the top cabinet positions. And so you see that and you say, again, all this stuff's so hard to talk about just because, there's this old joke I heard one time, or I read in a book. I'm going to butcher it, but like, it's something to do with like, it's a Soviet bread line, and there's this old Jewish guy who's like going up and down the line, and he keeps asking, like, are there any Jews working at the counter up there? Are there any Jews? And people are like, I don't know. And after a while, he gets up to somebody, says, are there any Jews working in the counter up there? And they go, yeah, I think 2 or 3. And then he steps back and goes, and how do you know that? You know what I mean? And like, and so it's like, it's tough to talk about any of these things for reasons that are entirely understandable, especially now, right? When you go onto Twitter, like anybody who goes on there, it's hard to talk about any of these things. But I think that, like, I think you have to be able to acknowledge, like, the things that, like, people don't go over and fall off into the anti-Semite, like, brainworm just because a Jewish person cut them off in traffic. It's an internet phenomenon, these days, where people go on and they're told information that they can't find anywhere else except if they go to websites that, are going to get them on a list somewhere. But then they find out somewhere, some old historical text, that, like, this thing is true. It's only ever one side of the story, and it leaves a whole bunch of context out that, like, would explain it a lot better.
But the biggest audience you ever had was you telling people that the reason the worst thing in human history happened was because the Jews
Yeah,
put Hitler in.
Fair, but like, look, I've told you before. First, I didn't know we were going to talk about World War II. I wasn't prepared to talk about that. I definitely know we were going to talk about Churchill. And if you watched, and I know you watched it, if you watched the thing, and there were a couple instances like this, like that you mentioned earlier, when he was like, well, "What about Japan? Why is Japan doing fine?" and so forth, where I felt like he was trying to draw me into like deep waters that I was not comfortable with. And I think you could see it in the interview where like I start to get a little shifty in my seat and less articulate because I'm,
A wry smile, yeah.
yeah, and that wry smile, by the way, was like, it was sort of taken as like a knowing smile when, really what it was a smile of like, what are you trying to do to me here,
Yeah.
And so by the time I got to the David Irving argument, which is where that comes from, the stuff about Churchill being bailed out by financiers in 38 and 40, which did happen. He had already asked me like twice, like, well, why would Churchill do this if it didn't make any sense for the British Empire? And I kind of walked around and gave like a meandering answer. And he said, well, why else? And I did it again, kind of again off the top of my head, because I wasn't planning on talking about this. He's like, well, why else? And I'm like, well, people have written
Okay,
about
so,
this. And
so what you're describing
da-da-da-da-da.
is Tucker's baiting you to blame the Jews. You realize he's setting the trap. He says, why else? Why else? And you could have said, Tucker, I'm not going there. If you're implying that it was the Jews, no.
Yeah, no. Well, look, yeah, maybe. Like there's a reason I don't do interviews very often, you talk about the white nationalist I interviewed back in the day, and the reason that interview went so terribly, like, was not because we ended up screaming at each other. It was because I was totally friendly to him, because he was completely friendly to me, and that's just the pattern I fall into. I'm an agreeable person, and that's a very confrontational thing to say. And if you're going to be in media and doing interviews and stuff, you should be able to do that.
But you actually let him bait you into, and I listen. I don't know if
I don't want to accuse him of baiting me. First of all, like I want to be clear about that. I don't
But
know.
you- okay,
I
all
don't
right,
know what he was doing. It felt like he was trying to like the explanations I was giving before they weren't sufficient, and I needed to like pull something else out. And so yeah, like I don't want to say he was baiting me. I mean, obviously Tucker knows how to draw controversy out of a thing, and that's kind of his expertise. So maybe there was some of that, but I don't want to make that.
I mean, I'll ask you then. I didn't really, if not for Jewish concerns about what was happening to the Jews,
Yeah,
would World War II have happened?
100%.
Would have happened. It would have.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, no question about it, man. Look, and this is like, again, like if I could do that whole interview over again, like one of the just main things that I would not do, I wouldn't focus on Churchill, because Churchill was a functionary of British imperial policy that was being carried out, and if he was bailed out by people who were who had ties and sympathies to the Zionist project or to what was happening to the Jews in Germany, it wasn't that didn't, that wasn't a bribe that like made him disavow his previous beliefs and now go and behave like in accordance with their values. He always felt that way. And this is a person maybe that they just wanted to keep relevant in politics because he was an ally, and that's fine. That's politics. But yeah, 100% World War II would have happened. I mean, you could have taken Churchill out of the picture in 1940, and Great Britain is not going to make peace with Germany at that point,
Right. Well,
which I think is wrong. I think it was wrong. Like, I think that was terrible. I don't think it's right to hold Churchill accountable for that. And so therefore, I think it's wrong to hold whoever it is, people think financed him or whatever accountable for it, because I don't think he himself was really accountable for that decision.
all right, we have to wrap it up. So just to be clear, so you don't have a problem with Israel as an ethno state? Is that because I'm surprised that
No.
yeah. So now you're gonna get in trouble with your followers again. I think the word ethno state is an ugly term because it implies that it erases the long history of being backed into the conclusion that the only way we can survive and live fulfilling lives is by having a state which is dedicated to our protection. That's as opposed to the ethno state of the old South, which is we hate everybody else, and you know, we don't want blacks here because we hate them, and you know, this gets into the Arab-Israeli conflict, and maybe we will have that conversation someday. But that particular charge of ethno state always bothers me because of
The people who have had control of that term for a long time have definitely put a lot of baggage onto it, and I guess like I just kind of use it as a technical term, and yeah, I have no problem with it. I think
as opposed
that
to homeland for the Jewish people. And you know,
yeah, sure.
I said recently to somebody, like, you know, this idea of a one state solution, and this goes to what you were saying about how you would reconstruct American or Western governments. Can you imagine a single state solution which where you had to find the common denominator of acceptable rights between the Israelis and Hamas? I mean, it would be there'd be the equal rights would be barely any rights at all. The only, I joked you'd have equal rights at least for circumcision for men and women, which is probably not fair because that's probably not doesn't even happen. That's a flippant thing to say, but it's a way of illustrating the fact that the conception of what rights there ought to be is
Yeah.
so wildly different between and it would be a Muslim majority, and this kind of like basic argument, like there's so many criticisms of Israel I can agree with or stipulate to, but this notion that there could be a one state solution,
I don't know. I don't
is
think that, by the
so
way.
to me, but it's so blatantly disingenuous to me that it makes it difficult for me to take everything that came before in the person's presentation
Yeah, people. I
seriously
think
and
people
respectfully.
who are pushing for it, like in an apparently like sincere way, that like I think that's disingenuous or ignorant in the
Yeah.
extreme. But I do think it's a valuable like rhetorical device. You know what I mean? To just illustrate like a counterpoint or something. Like people will bring up Native American reservations and stuff today, and then I point out to them, Native Americans are full citizens of our country. They have all political and civil rights anybody else. If you want to do that in Israel, go for it, and then nobody will have anything to complain about. But you know, so it's a rhetorical device, I guess, in that sense. And no, I look, if I was an Israeli man, there's that little blow up going up on Twitter right now because Ta-Nehisi Coates in an interview was saying something yesterday about how he would, if he'd grown up in Gaza, would find it hard not to participate in October 7th. People are going crazy about it. I I mean, look, I don't like a lot of what he says, but like I entirely understand what he is saying. Like not just on an intellectual level, but on an emotional level. Because if I was an Israeli and I grew up in Israel, I guarantee you I would be like, you know, pushing to get into a special forces unit to go and fight in this war and kill the enemies of my people. Like I think anybody can understand that on some level. If I was back in the 1960s and I was black living in Watts, I don't want to go march for peace. I want to join the Black Panthers. Like I get that.
But that's not the point. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
you know, the thing is to say something like that, like you get back to that thing of like, dude, like people are watching. You're not talking about a historical event. You're talking about something that people are watching this video whose daughter was killed, and you're not accounting for that. And when you say things, you know, like this, and again, it's a fine line, hard line sometimes to walk, but it is an important one, you know. So
But I would say about Ta-Nehisi, you can make the argument to me. I mean, I'm just gonna. I don't even the stuff he said. I would disagree with a lot of it. But for the sake of brevity, I will stipulate to the oppression that he describes, and I'll stipulate that the poverty he describes is only the fault of the Israelis. I don't believe that, obviously, but I can stipulate to all that. You can make the argument that such oppression and poverty can lead somebody to commit murder. But if you won't also admit that murder and suicide belts can't lead somebody to say, I think we ought to have checkpoints, then you're not a serious person. And this is where he's disqualified. And this is where I have contempt for him. Like, fine, this is, yeah, in the Warsaw Ghetto, like, would they kill some Nazi German babies? And would I understand? Like, well, at some point, people reach a breaking point and they do terrible things. Fine, but you can't also understand that when you're on the other side of it and they're blowing up your children in cafes and your government says, you know what? We need checkpoints here because we have to see, we know who the bad guys are. And no. That's awful. I don't even need
Yeah,
to.
but is there a number of cafes that get blown up that the practical argument I get, but is there a number of cafes that get blown up that morally justify the Nazi checkpoints in
Fair
Warsaw?
enough. No, that's where it gets an interesting conversation. That's kind of like a conversation that we had about stop and frisk to fight crime. Is a you know, fine. How many? You're gonna check every black guy because you prevented 10 murders? These are difficult questions, and you need a soulful, judicious, non-bigoted heart to approach these things, and that is in rare supply, especially these days. But what I'm saying is that for him to say that's not even a question is even worth discussing. I'm not even going to devote a sentence in my book to it. It's wrong. It's like I'm going to write a book about how my wife keeps hitting me. She's beating me. Are you going to mention the fact that you were hitting her too? No, that's enough. Plenty of people told that story. I don't need to. I said, you're not a serious person, dude. So that's where he loses me. He's not a fair-minded person. He's not even attempting. Anybody who thinks this is an easy conflict, including obviously this goes for the Jews, the Israelis. You remember, I don't know if you knew this, the first day after October 7th when they were counting everything in 9/11s, I said, don't do that because they're going to start counting Gazans in 9/11s. And that kind of inability.
Well, and I mean, I took it as like, you're a New Yorker. You know what I mean? Like you don't just throw things like that out there, you know? And
I'm just saying, like the rare number of people who immediately make an argument and immediately try to apply it to the other side through the eyes of the person on the other side. It's a very small number, and like I said, there's plenty of Jews like that. But Ta-Nehisi is one of the most vulgar examples I've ever seen of it. And in a different political issue, a guy who is that brazen about not wanting to even entertain any conversation of the other side of a story would never find himself on CBS interviews. The intellectual community would not bother with a guy who was wearing proudly, breaking all the rules of an intellectual consideration that has integrity. He's just like, no, I don't need to even consider this other stuff. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I don't know. Just to be clear, I don't know anything about him. I know like
read the book.
Headline level, like of what he's about. I've never read his book or any of his books. So
and by the way, he would never ever, and this goes back to what we were saying before. He will never extend that allowance of psychology to anything done by a white person in the Old South. Right? He will never say, well, if I was white in the Old South and only saw black people, so beneath me, and I might not even realize that we were all of the same level, and I might not even realize that slavery was wrong. No, they get no time and place. Only one population on Earth is supposed to be divinely accountable for every moral thing, and no psychology is allowed to them whatsoever, and that's Israel. And that's what a guy like me has a beef with, the way the world discusses Israel. All right, Darryl, I don't know, the reason I want to maintain our relationship is because there's a very small number of people out there who I ever have an argument with who we can say, no, let's look it up. And say, no, it says this. And both people say, oh, no, you're right. Okay, well, I guess I got to integrate that in some different way. That's the only people you can really have constructive conversations with. And though I don't agree with you, obviously, and I don't want to sugarcoat it, I do worry that your views in your private Dostoevsky heart are worse from my point of view than you're letting on, because I think the shadow that I'm seeing is that if you felt 100% the way you're representing, that I think you would lift more of a finger to really disabuse your flock, as it were, of the notion that you're a fellow traveler. But having said all that, I do admire a lot of your work, and I maybe over time, you on me and me on you, we will wear each other down in some way where we both improve. I don't know.
Yeah, that's yeah, that's a good way to end it. That's a good hope. Yeah, I would like to continue the conversation sometime, because it's kind of disappointing that you think there's still something that needs to be dug out that I'm concealing. Which
I only see it in the relief of, like, well, if he felt that, why the hell doesn't he make sure these people don't misunderstand him? I get your answer. I take your
yeah, I
answer.
don't want. Well, okay, we'll talk about that part another
Yeah.
time. But I just yeah, it's something. I mean, like, here's the thing. Like, when I say we could have that conversation privately. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter to me. Like, it's important to me because I trust you and I consider you a friend. So it matters to me if you think something like that. Not like my broader perception. Like, dude, I'm probably banned from 6 European countries at this point after that Tucker interview. And like, yeah, I like, people are going to Google my name for the rest of my life and they're going to find that stuff. And so that's all done. And I really honestly, like, I couldn't have told you this before it all happened, but now that it has happened, like, I don't know. I don't really care, just because I'm a person who's always been like focused on my family and my friends, and then the family and friends of those people. And that's kind of my politics and my world. And as long as that's intact, I'm fine. But it does mean too that, like, when there's somebody like you that I respect, uh, it's important to me that you understand that, not that we agree on everything, or even on like things that are considered like deep emotional or moral issues to one or both of us or something, we agree on them, so that but just that, that I'm coming from a good place, or at least like a place that's, um, you know, I'll end with this. And this is I've told myself a million times that I should quit Twitter, and the only reason I still do it is because I have a podcast to promote. Because I do think it brings out the worst in us in a lot of ways. And people ask all the time, "How is it that you're this way in your podcast and this way on Twitter?" And I say, "The medium's the message," in a way, which doesn't release me from accountability, but I think there's something to it. So one of my an author I really like, American author John Gardner. He wrote that book Grendel. I don't know if you read it. It's a good book. But he's like a creative writing professor, and he wrote creative writing books and stuff. And he was a great writer. And you read his other books, like besides Grendel, especially, they're like just family novels. And the level of emotional intelligence and just empathy that he has for all of these different range of characters, men, women, old, young, everything is incredible. And he was a terrible person in real life. He beat his wife. He was an alcoholic. He was just a bad guy. He did bad things. And somebody asked him one time, "How is it possible that you can write these characters with such moral sensitivity and then do those things?" And he said that, "I'm a better person when I'm writing." And there's something like that with me when I go on Twitter. The old troll from like 1999 message boards comes out, and that desire to provoke and start, like that. And look, when you have an audience of 300,000 people on Twitter like I do now, uh, you know, it's a different world. You're not having a relationship with your followers in the same way. You're broadcasting to the world, in a way. And I haven't really made that adaptation. I'm the first one to kind of say that. And I don't always account for those things. But again, that's why I really value someone like you, because it's important to have people out there who you can trust or not coming at you in bad faith or with some other agenda when they tell you, like, dude, you're being an asshole here, that you can trust them, when they say that. And so, yeah, I appreciate our relationship very much, man.
All right. So Darryl, I do appreciate our relationship. I have to tell you that, you threw me for a loop, but
That's why,
I gotta take
I've
it
told
in.
people this too.
Yeah.
That's why everything that's happened with you and the way you've responded to everything since that Tucker interview, as much as I appreciate, like, people who have known me for years and just they're never gonna betray me or turn on me, and they're going out and just defending me with a full throat and everything because I love Darryl or whatever. As much as I appreciate that, on some level, like I appreciate you a lot even more, just because those people weren't tested. Those people are like, they're attacking my friend, I'm gonna go defend my friend. You had to look at this and say, I don't really know what's going on here. I don't, it's something that you struggle to explain to yourself. And I know you've taken heat for refusing to to come out and condemn me. And yeah, it means a lot to me that you have that you have not done so, but done it in a way where you make very, very clear to me, like, the things that you find objectionable or that you're having trouble explaining. I appreciate it. I really do.
I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I'm happy that you think that I've been fair to you today. And then obviously I did speak my mind, and that won't be enough for people either. But I did speak my mind. I haven't held anything back, and that's as it should be in conversations between people who take each other seriously. All right, Darryl. So we'll take this up again online, and maybe I hope we'll have future conversations. I have to take my daughter to the airport now. I'm taking for her birthday present my daughter and one of her friends to for the long weekend in Los Angeles, and they get to choose the entire itinerary of the trip or whatever. So I'm really looking forward to that. So I'll have this up in a couple of days. Like, I won't edit out a single word that you said. All right.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Okay, Darryl. Take it easy.